Hi, welcome to the Sacred Significance Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Veronica Cochran. Thank you so much for joining me today. Now, hopefully you were a part of this series 2, episode 1, where we went into a lot of detail around core messages. We talked about what they are. We talked about the source of them, how they get integrated as scripts and narrators of our world. But today, you and I are going to talk specifically about the source, the subtle source of these particular messages. And you and I are going to talk at length about how they become kind of a felt sense, right? Maybe not fact-based, but more a sense that we have from these sources that think they know a lot about who and what we are. So you won't want to miss this episode. I want you to get your pencil and your paper because we're getting ready to throw it down. Let's go. And you and I have been talking about core messages, right? We define core messages, and those are those messages that carry significant weight. They have been conveyed to us kind of very subtly, not always through a spoken word, maybe through a gesture, maybe a look somebody gave you. You know, if you think about this, our moms were really good at this. We wanted to kind of rein us in. There was a look they could give us, and we internalized the message, right? We understood exactly what the look meant so that you and I got ourselves in line. So she didn't have to actually say anything. So we're talking about those kind of messages. Sometimes they're not always spoken. We talked about how important it is to understand that central messages sometimes aren't what was heard. They are what was not heard, right? So we talked a little bit about silence or the absence of affirmation, maybe just the absence of somebody encouraging you and saying you can do it, or you were good at this, or you were good at that. So that by itself is a core message. It's a message that was absent. And as a result, maybe you and I have been trying to find a way to get that message, or we've been working with that message of I'm not enough, or I'm not smart, whatever it is. But keep in mind, just because it wasn't spoken doesn't mean it's not a message. All right. And because maybe it was spoken in a positive doesn't actually mean that we didn't take it as something negative. Right. So sometimes a statement like, I trust you. I trust you to do the right thing, right? Sometimes, depending on who we are, the implication of that could mean I do have your trust, or it could actually mean I don't have your trust, and I'm asking you to really think about what you're doing. So I want you to see that as subtle as the messages are, the subjective implication of those messages is huge, right? So this explains why maybe 2 people, 3 people can grow up in the exact same household, and they all have very different experiences. They all turn out incredibly different, twins, triplets, or whatever, because the messages they internalize, the environments in which they soaked up those messages have shaped their sense of self, right? So you and I understand the gravity, the criticality of this conversation, because it is the underlying premise from which our sense of self kind of has arisen. So we were talking about these core messages that carry so much meaning. Again, can be the absence of a message. Silence for me was a huge message in my household, right? So again, nothing spoken, but silence had incredible meaning for me. And in the silence, I experienced feelings maybe more around fear, because I knew the silence meant I'd done something wrong. And then as a result, it also meant maybe that things weren't going to go well that evening, you know. So sometimes, you know, you and I have walked through these situations as children or young adults, and we've internalized and absorbed a lot of environments, maybe where things weren't spoken, but I internalized the message anyway. And for me, that was the silence. So here's what we know. We know they are messages that carry great weight. We know they are messages that were conveyed from an external source that may be working to become an internal script. We know that it has great capacity to shape how I see myself, how I feel about myself, ultimately things I do, right? Because everything we do comes from a sense of who I believe I am. So when you talk about the sources of these messages, I mean, it could be something as simple as gender identities, right? It can be something as simple as, well, women cook and do laundry and men go make the money and bring their checks home, right? So these messages were things you and I heard, and even if we didn't hear them in that way, maybe they were the subtle expectation So a core message can actually be an expectation. It can be a role expectation. You're the older sibling. You know what that means? That means you have to take care of the younger siblings. It means you have to grow up a little faster, maybe take on a lot more responsibility, maybe even than you were ready for. So you can see how these messages, as subtle as they are, right, have great capacity to shape us. So let's talk about the primary sources of these messages. One, I think none would maybe challenge, familial. Most of our upbringing will find the seed bed a lot of these messages, right? Remember we talked about sometimes the message wasn't spoken to me, but it was spoken in my presence regarding someone else. As a result, I interpreted a part of the message that wasn't spoken to me, that was spoken to the other person, right? So those messages become mine, right? Even though mom was talking to a sibling about how great they did on an exam or how great they did in band or how great they played their instrument, well, the result was I overheard the conversation and I absorbed a message maybe that I wasn't so great about the things I was doing or working on, right? So familial, if you go back to the story of Jacob, we find in this story all kinds of seeds for identity, seeds for things like favoritism. We find this incredible conversation around worth and value, right? All those messages are steeped deep in that study for us as we can begin to see how Esau and Jacob grow radically different based on some of the messages they received, right? So I want you to consider from a family standpoint, maybe you're the youngest, maybe you're the oldest, but I want you to consider, are there messages, maybe subtle messages that you absorbed that you can see maybe how they're shaping and showing up for you today? Are there places where those messages that were once spoken by somebody other than you are now being spoken by you? I want you to consider that. I want you to really think about it. And it might be uncomfortable, sometimes to excavate and really understand who I became and maybe why. Not only does it take a lot of courage, it takes sometimes a lot of energy, a lot of courage to look into places we would rather not look. So we know family plays a big role. What about social media? Sometimes social media really can be really difficult for people because we see everybody, on social media, man, they are living their best lives. They're showing us their vacation pictures. They're showing us their family pictures, their anniversary pictures, their kids graduating. And depending on where we are in life, man, like we look at those and we immediately measure ourselves against those pictures. We don't even know what else is going on, right? We have a one-dimensional picture. And from that, we tell ourselves an entire story. And a lot of that story, right, it's called social comparison theory. And what that has an implication for is that we use everything as a comparison to how I'm doing in life. So social media becomes like a mirror to show me, well, you're not going on vacation. You don't have any kids. You're not even married yet, whatever it is. And so as a result, that can be a very harsh report card. It can be a harsh measure of evaluation. Now, it doesn't even stop at just the measure. You know what happens? We are motivated by that measurement, right? This ability to look at something and draw some sort of implication for myself. We are motivated to figure out how to become better, how to improve, how to perfect something, or how to be something other. So even when we're watching social media, I wonder how many times you've seen somebody that you thought, oh, I'm going to do that. Or maybe I'm going to stop doing that, right? Or maybe I'm going to post a picture of my workout or whatever it is. I want you to see how easy, I want you to see how subtle, I want you to see how simple that comparison is. And it doesn't just create the measure, it creates the movement. What's important about this part of the dialogue for us is that means that your behaviors are a direct reflection, we talked about this, of what your sense of self is, right? So you cannot outperform your sense of self. You cannot underperform your sense of self, which means your sense of self is the invisible KPI that's running everything. It's the blueprint, right? Now, the construct, which is what you and I have become, is a result of the blueprint. So when you understand that these particular messages are finding their scaffolding and building a construct, this is called conditioning, right? We've been conditioned to see everything in comparison to who we believe we are. And then we say these little subtle things. Am I enough? Do I speak that well? Am I that pretty? And then we just, and then off of all of that data, we begin moving to improve, to perfect, to show, to demonstrate. right? Which is why this idea of proving and performance centricity is such a big part of our sense of self. We talked about that in series 1, how we become performance oriented because I have to prove that I'm just as good. I have to prove I'm just as smart. So you have to understand where these things come from. And guess what? This is still not your sacred self. This is the construct. This is the conditioning, right? So out of that, not only do we see the familial source, what about the cultural one? Something as simple. I think about David, when David was going up against Goliath and the king said to him, you're going to need some armor, right? Only warriors defeat giants. Listen to the cultural implication. Like, you're not a man of war, you're a boy. So if David had taken that message in, I would dare say he would have never defeated Goliath, right? Because that behavior, the outcome, the output of that sense of belief would have cost him a victory. So when you think about the implications of culture, I want you to consider that. I mean, I actually, when I went to nursing school, for me, I actually wanted to be a doctor, but at the time I thought, oh, wow, that's going to take a lot more time. I don't know if I'm smart enough for that, and so as a result, you can even see, that some of those messages early on, especially when, like for me, I used to always hear, you are so bossy. And what is a message for girls is girls are not bossy. Right? Bossy is bad, right? So no matter, even if it's you showing responsibility, it's a negative. So you work not to be seen as bossy. So I want you to see the cultural implication. Maybe you made career choices based on what was expected in the culture, based on somebody's idea of what women should do versus men should do. All right. So I want you to really think about where this anchors in you. And I think what's maybe most profound for us today is I want you to consider that there is a sacred source to messages, right? We find, and this is probably in Matthew 3, where we hear God say to Jesus, you are my beloved son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear ye him. Now, can you imagine a message like that? You are my son, like the ownership of that, the incredible acceptance of that, the affirmation of that, the approval of that. See, that's what I want. That's what I want for you and I. I want us to get to where our messages are self-supporting. Our messages are sacred. They are sound. Our messages support our true and essential self so that we're not being defined by life experience, our failures, our wishes, our misses, our, failed steps, whatever it is. So whether it's familial sources, cultural sources, gender sources, role expectations, role identities, I want you to lean into the sacred source of messages about you and I. And I always bring you back to Jeremiah 1:5, right? That's a sacred source of a message that you've got to hear. It's a sacred source. Another one is you are made in the image and likeness of God. What a profound message that is. Like, how would that change how you show up if we could incorporate that in our understanding and the actualization of who we are? It would change how we show up because we would have nothing to prove. Because you and I are made in the image and likeness of God. He does know who we are apart from experience, apart from everything, all the trippings of culture. He knows exactly who you are, right? So where I want us to maybe close today's episode is we talked about this idea of comparison. We talked about the subtle sources. We talked about the implication of these and how they drive us to perform and they motivate us to move. And, I want you to just become, maybe the word is just aware, right? I want you just to begin to see maybe where some of the sources of those messages are for you. Like for me, silence was the thing. If I came in the house after school and it was quiet, I just knew I had done something and probably was going to be in some sort of trouble. What was the subtle message for you? What was the subtle message that you absorbed in an environment that maybe now is showing up in how you enter a room, and how you socialize with people and how you interact? How is it affecting the way you live, the way you lead, and maybe the way you love? I want you to really consider the source of those messages and how they are showing up for you. Because guess what? We're going to a place where we're going to talk about how they get interpreted, how they get integrated, and how they've shaped our identity. But we're going to revisit the shaping and talk about how do we rewire ourselves so that our essential self is where we're playing from, the self that is not defined by anything other than itself. So you and I are going to move into those episodes. You won't want to miss it. I'm going to ask you, call a friend, invite a partner, somebody to be on the podcast with you. Listen, it's been amazing to hang out with you. Thank you for joining me for episode 2 of season 2. You will not want to miss episode 3, right? We're going to be talking about how these messages become internal scripts, how they become the silent narrator of our lives. You won't want to miss it. I'm going to see you there.